All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Small Business Scams webinar during National Consumer Protection Week, hosted by the Iowa Secretary of State's office and the Iowa Attorney General's office. My name is Ashley, and I am the Business Services Outreach Specialist here at our office. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded for future use, but your name and details are hidden from other participants. We are going to have a moderated Q&A session to conclude this webinar. So feel free to post your questions in the Q&A chat box, but just make sure that they're in that box labeled Q&A. And we will do our best to answer as many of those as possible. Additionally, our presenters may also have some discussion questions during this portion. And so to answer these questions, please also just use that same Q&A chat box. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Pate for some remarks.
Thank you, Ashley, and greetings. I'm Iowa Secretary of State Paul Pate. And I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar with the Iowa Attorney General's Office during National Consumer Protection Week. As the small business portal for the state of Iowa, my team frequently hears of stories about what is affecting anything from one-person businesses all the way up to some of the largest companies in our state. As fraudsters scale up efforts to harm both businesses and consumers, it's increasingly important to be proactive and to remain vigilant to prevent yourself or your company from becoming a victim. According to the Federal Trade Commission, Iowa consumers reported a total loss of $21.2 million to fraud during this year. With numbers this staggering, it's important to know and keep in mind that it's just not consumers alone that are impacted by these losses. The number is only the tip of the iceberg. There's far more fraud there than is even getting reported. A short time ago, my office became aware of an active scam that affected more than 1,200 businesses across the state. There was an entity that was cheating business owners out of their hard-earned money by sending letters that appeared to be coming from my office. Well, thankfully, our partners at the Attorney General's office were able to aggressively go after the fraudster and recoup the losses businesses around the state incurred as a result of their deception. Unfortunately, in today's increasingly online world, data is easy to grab, and these scams are all too common. But with the information from today's presentation, I hope you can take away some tips and tricks to be equipped to stop fraudsters in their tracks. Thank you to our presenters from the Attorney General's office for joining us today to speak on the importance of the work that you do.
All right, thank you, Secretary Pate, for those remarks. And I'm happy to welcome our presenters today, Andrew Cedardahl and Bill Pearson from the Iowa Attorney General's office for a beneficial and timely presentation today. Andrew Cedardahl is Assistant Attorney General in the Consumer Protection Division of the Iowa Department of Justice. Andrew investigates and prosecutes imposter, health, mail, telemarketing, and other consumer frauds. Prior to joining the Attorney General's office, Andrew represented low-income victims of elder abuse and exploitation as an Elder Justice Fellow at Iowa Legal Aid. And Bill Pearson is Assistant Attorney General in the Consumer Protection Division of the Iowa Department of Justice. Bill investigates and prosecutes data breach, privacy, and technology platform cases, as well as other consumer frauds. Prior to working in the Consumer Protection Division, Bill represented the state of Iowa in employment and tort cases in the Special Litigation Division. Prior to joining the AG's office, Bill worked at law firms in San Francisco and New York. Bill lives in Des Moines with his wife, 2 boys, and a dog. He is looking forward to RAGBRAI this summer. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters, and thank you all again for joining us today.
All right. Good morning. My name is Bill Pearson. I'm going to try and share my screen here. How do we view this as the slideshow? All right. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction, Ashley, and thank you to Secretary Pate. As he mentioned, we've had a good working relationship with that office, and it's helped us to protect Iowa consumers and Iowa small businesses. And yeah, we're happy to be here today and happy to talk to you a little bit about things we've seen and the ways you can protect yourselves and what we do in our office. So first, just a little overview. Who are we? What do we do? Andrew and I are Assistant Attorneys General in the Consumer Protection Division. Our division currently is about 7 attorneys and 6 investigators. There's been a little flux with the change in administrations and with retirements and things like that. But I think those are the current numbers, and we have some support staff that help us out as well. the main thrust of our division is we try to protect consumers by enforcing statutes that give us powers to protect consumers. The main statute is the Iowa Consumer Fraud Act, which very broadly sort of protects consumers, which is defined to include, any individual, basically anyone who buys anything. So that would be small business, large business, individuals, anyone who expends money in the state of Iowa would be an Iowa consumer. And we're armed with a lot of tools to protect Iowa consumers from unfair or deceptive acts and practices. A deceptive act is sort of exactly what it sounds like. An act or practice which has tendency or capacity to mislead a substantial number of consumers as to a material fact or facts. So just any attempt to deceive consumers would be considered a violation of the Consumer Fraud Act. An unfair practice is, I would say, maybe a little squishier. And I guess I should caveat all of the statements I'm making today with they're my personal views. Anything that sounds like an opinion today isn't the opinion of the state of Iowa or the Attorney General. Just want to make that clear. So an unfair practice is the practice an act or practice which causes substantial unavoidable injury to consumers that is not outweighed by any consumer or competitive benefits which the practice produces. And those would be things like one of the scams that Andrew's going to talk about later on, and that Secretary Pate mentioned in his opening remarks, in which the consumers got what they paid for, but in our view, it was both deceptive and unfair. And Andrew will talk a little bit more about that later and flesh it out a little more. The Consumer Fraud Act gives our office, the Attorney General, broad pre-lawsuit powers, including the ability to issue and enforce subpoenas, seek pre-lawsuit injunctions. We can take things called sworn statements, which are essentially depositions or witness interviews under oath. And under the Consumer Fraud Act, the Attorney General can obtain consumer reimbursement. So any monies that were taken from consumers via these deceptive or unfair practices, disgorgement of ill-gotten gains, and that applies sort of in a situation which it's impossible to get all the money back to consumers. Maybe we don't know who all the consumers are, or maybe it's such a small amount of money per consumer that it's not worth it to print and mail checks. But this is still ill-gotten money by fraudsters that they shouldn't be allowed to keep. The act also gives us the power to collect civil penalties of up to $40,000 per violation and attorney's fees and costs if we have to bring an action to enforce. Another important thing for you folks to know is there's a private right of action in the Consumer Fraud Act. And that allows individual consumers to bring actions for violations of the Consumer Fraud Act. And that's useful for a lot of reasons. Our office, as the Attorney General, we represent the state. And so we receive complaints, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we investigate them, but sometimes they don't rise to the level of the state interest or protecting the state. Maybe they're just a one-off complaint about a business. Maybe we don't think it's substantial enough to pursue with our limited resources. But in that case, you still would have recourse. You could still bring an action under the Consumer Fraud Act, private right of action, and you can still recover. You had similar recovery, and plus, if you had an attorney representing you, they can still get their attorney's fees and costs in those actions as well. Other statutes we enforce, there's something known as the Door-to-Door Sales Act. I think this is maybe a little bit of an anachronism from the days when vacuum and encyclopedia salesmen went door to door. But it regulates the sale of consumer goods that occur in a place other than the seller's place of business. And you can imagine this is, this section is designed to protect consumers in cases of just high pressure sales situations. Someone shows up at your front door trying to sell you magazines or any number of things. Maybe one of those infamous timeshare sales pitches at a hotel ballroom, all sorts of things in which you're in a high pressure situation where, there's a salesman who is outside of their normal place of business trying to sell you things. It mandates, among other things, that all door-to-door sellers provide specific notices regarding each consumer's right to cancel the transaction for any reason within 3 business days. So Andrew prosecutes a lot of those, and a lot of people help a lot of people get their money back in transactions they feel they were pressured into and not given the opportunity to back out of. And one of the statutes I work a lot on is the security breach notification statute. And this is an important statute, both for you as an individual, as a business, and if you are a business that happens to collect any information from consumers that would be considered personal information under the statute. The statute protects personal information, which is defined basically to include mostly financial information, social security numbers, government ID numbers, credit card bank account numbers, things of that nature that could be used to steal your identity or perpetrate a financial fraud against you. And if your personal information is breached, and I think we probably have all gotten many of these breach notices, you're entitled to notice from the company that was holding your information. And if over 500 Iowans are affected, then notice must be provided to our office within, I think, 5 business days of it being sent to consumers. And violations of both the Door-to-Door Sales Act and the Security Breach Notification Act are defined in the statutes as violations of the Consumer Fraud Act as well. So that gives us sort of additional powers to enforce those statutes. As promised, I'll talk a little bit about our complaint intake process. So if you think you're the victim of a fraud, what do you do? Well, the first thing you can do is, one of the things you can do is contact our office. Our website's listed on here, iowaattorneygeneral.gov. There's a For Consumers tab. That's the link directly to it. You can email us at consumer@ag.iowa.gov. We also have a phone number. We also have a fax machine. If you still have one of those kicking around at your business, you could fax us, I suppose. But those other methods are probably easier and more expedient. And we, in cases of frauds that we're going to investigate, we typically require a written complaint form to open a formal complaint. And that form is on our website. You could fill it out there. You could print it and mail it. You could call and we could mail you one. And it asks just for sort of basic information about what you're complaining about. And that would be things like the business or individual that you think you were defrauded by, how much money, the nature of the fraud, and then you can also attach any additional information you have, like invoices, contracts, things like that. We also track informal complaints. There are certain instances where consumers might not want to file a formal complaint and just want to let us know of things that have happened. Maybe they weren't actually the victim of a fraud. Maybe they were able to protect themselves, by not giving their credit card number or their bank account number or something like that. But they wanted us to be aware of it, and we track those. And sometimes those reach the levels of us opening a sort of investigation on our own without a formal complaint, especially if there are a lot of complaints about the same business or the same entity or the same individual. And I guess another reason that someone might not want to file a formal complaint is that they are considered open records under Iowa Code Chapter 22. And I also wanted to add that, as small business owners, sometimes you may have a dispute with a consumer who buys something from your small business, and you may be the target of one of these consumer complaints and consumer investigations. And what I would say in that case, is it doesn't necessarily mean you did anything wrong, obviously. It just means that there's some sort of dispute between you and a customer. And if you receive an investigation notice from us, my advice would be to, cooperate as fully as possible. And, and generally, we work these things out informally. But we receive almost 3,000 complaints per year, and then recall that we have 6 investigators. So that's about 500 per investigator and 7 attorneys. And so we're spread pretty thin on a lot of these things. So we don't pursue all of them. And that's what the private right of action helps with. And, that's what some of this informal resolution helps with. And I listed on this slide a few of the top complaint categories we have from this last year. And we had, as you can see, autos, used cars are kind of far and away the biggest category. We had 532 complaints about those. Healthcare fraud, home improvement fraud. And that runs the gamut from shoddy work product to just taking your money up front and not building your deck or not remodeling your kitchen or anything like that. And that's a pretty big area of fraud, and that's a pretty big area of it's a big expenditure for people. And so those can be pretty intensive. Imposter scams, people calling saying they're someone they aren't, stealing money from you. That way, personal services that can run the gamut of all sorts of things. So that's a pretty big category as well. And so when we receive an informal complaint or a formal complaint, from a consumer, the first thing we do is figure out which of the 6 investigators that's routed to. Our investigators are sort of divided into, they handle this various different areas. We have an investigator for autos, we have an investigator for credit card fraud, things of that nature. We collect the formal complaint form, any additional information submitted with the form, things like invoices, any correspondence you may have had that you may have had with the person you're complaining about, with the business that you're having a problem with, and any follow-up with the consumer complainant. So oftentimes our investigators will review the complaint form, they'll review the other information submitted with it, and they'll have more questions for you. So if you think you're the victim of a fraud and you submit the form and the investigator calls you, don't think it's because we doubt your story. It's just because we want to collect as much information as possible, because what we do after we've collected the information is we forward that on to the company or individual who's been complained about and give them an opportunity to respond. Because, as any good lawyer will tell you, there's 2 sides to every story, and we want to gather as much information as possible. And that goes back also to what I said earlier. If you're ever the target of one of these, this just gives you an opportunity to respond and tell your side of the story. This is what would happen. This is the service we provided the consumer. This is why it wasn't fraud. So these things, it's a two-way street. And a further investigation is warranted if we aren't able to resolve it that way. We have extensive pre-lawsuit investigatory powers under the statute. So we can issue subpoenas, or we call them civil investigative demands. And those are essentially, if you've ever been involved in any litigation, they're discovery requests. We can request documents, we can request written responses. And that's just to gather more information with the power of being able to go to court and compel responses. We can also take witness statements under oath. So we could ask you to come in and sit down with a court reporter and ask you some questions. And this is, things don't often escalate this far, but these are powers the statute gives us to protect consumers from fraud. And if the target of one of our investigations is uncooperative, we do have the power to go to court and compel responses to these things. So I guess with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew to talk a little bit about the resolution and that sort of process.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Andrew Cedardall. And before I speak, I will echo Bill's comments that these comments are my own, not necessarily the Attorney General's comments. And so I'll talk a little bit about resolution of our complaints. That might be kind of a process that businesses are curious about. What do we do after there's been a complaint and there's been a back and forth, and how do we sort of decide whether to take action and what sort of action we take? And it's understandable why people wouldn't necessarily know too many details about that. And the reason really is because there isn't necessarily a formula. There is no formula because we have discretion on cases that we bring. And so at any given time, it could be that there's various reasons why we will take actions that we will take, and there is no specific formula. But the vast majority of the time, if there is a complaint against a business, it's usually an informal resolution. For example, it's often the case that there's just no reason that we should take any additional action. It could be that the business made a simple mistake, or it was an oversight that led to the complaint, or there was a very hyper technical violation of the law, but it wasn't made in bad faith, and it didn't impact anyone except perhaps the complainant. And in that case, there's no reason for the office to necessarily get involved, because the consumer does, as Bill has mentioned, have that private right of action that they can rely upon if they feel that they would like to pursue it, number one. And number two, usually the business, most businesses are operating in good faith in Iowa, especially Iowa businesses. And so The business, if they become aware of an issue through the complaint process, will likely just issue a refund to the consumer if justified. So usually that will be fine, and we will have no concerns with that. It could also be the case we take no action because the consumer side of the story just isn't adding up, or they're asking us or the business to do something that just isn't reasonable, or frankly isn't within our authority. Even if we wanted to do something, it's not within our authority to do. And so we are attorneys and we have constraints, and there is a law that we enforce. And so the conduct that's being complained about has to meet the parameters of the law before we can actually do anything, whether we want to or not. And so if the consumer is asking us to do something we're not authorized to do, then obviously we can't take action on it. So most of the time we're not taking any legal action. We're over sort of mediating the complaint between the consumer and the business, and just monitoring to gather information. Now, if it is warranted that we should take further action based on the complaints, or say we're receiving a large volume of complaints about the same business for the same conduct, and that conduct is illegal or problematic, it could be that we determine an investigation is warranted. And so Bill already mentioned some of the tools that we have where we can begin that sort of investigation process for the public interest and the benefit of all Iowa consumers, and we are empowered to do that. And so if we're seeing patterns or issues among several consumers rather than just one or two, that can often signal that there is a pattern or practice here that is problematic. And so that could again warrant an investigation and further action on our part. And so when justified, if we uncovered that there were illegal, problematic, systemic issues impacting Iowa consumers as a group, that's often when we would file a lawsuit to stop that activity. Again, there's no formula for this. There's not a monetary threshold or a number threshold or anything. There's been several cases I've personally done where we've only had one or two complaints, but it turns out there were hundreds, if not 1,000 Iowa victims, but they just never complained to us. Or it could be the case that there are lots of victims that are complaining. There's just no formula for it. But we try to be dynamic and make sure that we are responsive to the problems that consumers are experiencing in Iowa. And so if we're filing a lawsuit, usually that means, again, there's a systemic issue impacting a group of consumers. It usually means that the business that's being complained about is intentionally using bad tactics, or they should know that the tactics they're using are bad, but they're using them anyway. Usually that's the sort of conduct that is bringing a lawsuit against them. Or as Bill mentioned, they're being uncooperative with an investigation. If we're just trying to gather facts and they're not cooperating with us, then that usually shows that they're hiding something and they're trying to evade accountability and responsibility for that. So I will just add before I turn it back to Bill, should you bother filing a complaint? I think there's this feeling probably with the public that, why even bother spending my time filing a complaint? They're never going to read it. They're never going to take action. I can tell you for the Consumer Protection Division, that isn't true. As I said earlier, I've personally had cases where it was one or two complaints, and it turns out that one or two complaints, that one complaint or those two complaints made us aware of a very big scam that was impacting a lot of people. And so we really do look at all of the complaints very seriously. And so it really is helpful to us. We cannot do our job if you do not make us aware of the things that are happening. I see it as a partnership between our division and the public. And so I do encourage all of you to file complaints if you do see anything illegal or predatory going on in Iowa that you think deserves our attention. Now I'll pass it back to Bill.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm just taking a minute to unmute there. And one other thing I'd like to add is another power we have under the statute before we move on a little bit is a power to seek if the Attorney General believes that a business that has violated the act, is currently violating the act, or is about to violate the act, we can seek a pre-lawsuit injunction to stop the behavior. And oftentimes that's enough, especially if we have an uncooperative target. Oftentimes going to the court for a temporary injunction about the conduct that's been complained about is enough to move along the target of the investigation a little bit, get them to a more reasonable position of settlement and refunding consumers and things of that nature. So Andrew and I have personally pursued temporary injunctions multiple times, and usually getting one of those, stopping the business practice in its tracks, usually is enough to get a recalcitrant target to cooperate a little bit more. Why is this not? Okay, there we go. Okay, and another thing I want to talk about, and this is sort of, you will never be the target of one of these as a small business owner. You may be the beneficiary of one of these, but another thing we work on in the office, another way we expend resources, another way that we get involved in helping stop fraud are large multi-state investigations, and we work together with large matters of national concern with other states, and a lot of these that I've worked on are in the data privacy sphere, and these end up being 45, 50 state, multi-state investigations where all the states band together because of a big national data security breach, in order to protect consumers from further harm to their personal data. And these just allow our offices to pool resources more efficiently to address national concerns. And some recent large multi-state investigations, I guess these aren't even all that recent, but our office has worked on the opioid settlements, which you may have read about in the news, a lot of mortgage settlements out of the mortgage crisis and the bad practices of some of the predatory lenders there, the tobacco settlements from 20 plus years ago that resulted in a lot of money to the state that has helped educate people and bring smoking rates down dramatically, and just frankly save lives. And that's the opioid settlements will do those as well, because they're going to bring in a lot of money to the state that the legislature can apportion to help alleviate the opioid crisis and hopefully help people kick the habit and save their lives. And the ones that I work on primarily in the multi-state context, at least, are data privacy cases. And I assume that probably most of the people on this call, because most adults in this country were the victims of the Equifax data security breach. So I'm assuming most of you heard of it. Most of you got a notice. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 million Americans, 1.5 million Iowans, something like that. Okay, here's the number actually, 1.125 million. So in 2017, Equifax announced just a massive data breach of their systems, and it exposed the credit files. And the credit files it's just everything that Equifax has on you. And if you know anything about credit reporting agencies like Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian, they collect a ton of data about you. Your payment histories on all your credit accounts, all those sorts of things, your social security number, your addresses. If you pull a copy of your credit report from freecreditreport.com, which I recommend, is one of the things I recommend you do periodically to protect yourself, and check and make sure there aren't any fraudulent accounts on there. That's the sort of thing that was in all 145.5 million of these files of Americans across the country. And this breach was a fairly egregious one. I mean, it was a result of Equifax's failure to patch a known critical vulnerability in one of its systems, a failure to monitor its systems, because once the hackers got in, which was, I think, April of 2017 or March, something like that, the hackers got in and they were in there undetected for 76 days. And they were able to move from server to server. So they hacked a consumer-facing portal where you could file credit disputes. So like I said, if you checked your credit report on freecreditreport.com, you found your Equifax credit report had some credit card you never opened and that was charged to the limit and nobody was paying the bill, and you disputed that, that was what this portal was for. But the hackers were able to then move from that portal to a different server that had the credit files of all 145.5 million Americans that Equifax had collected in a in an unencrypted, unsecured CSV file, which is just a giant Excel file. And they were able to export all of it. So in July 2019, there was a settlement announced jointly between all 50 state AGs, the Federal Trade Commission, and a consumer class action. And those consumer class actions would have been brought under the equivalent state statutes of our Consumer Fraud Act, the private right of action that I mentioned earlier. They would have been brought under the data breach notification laws, and they probably would have also just been brought under sort of common law tort theories. And so in addition to consumer remedies, Equifax agreed to significantly strengthen their security practices. And that was one of the big efforts of our office and the 50 states that were involved in this multi-state settlement, was to get them to sign an injunction requiring them to significantly strengthen their security practices, hire additional security people to secure data. So the settlement included a $425 million consumer restitution fund. And that was sort of a claims made process. You would have received, I mean, at this point, this is years ago and this is past, but you would have received a notice from the consumer class action saying you can claim up to $25 an hour for 20 hours of time spent dealing with the breach. If you could document any actual financial losses related to the breach, such as your identity being stolen, your checking account being raided or something like that. The cost of freezing your credit report and credit monitoring, those are all reimbursable expenses. And then affected consumers were also given the choice of free credit monitoring for 10 years and a $1 million identity theft insurance policy, or a one-time $125 payment. And I don't know if you followed this in the news, when this $125 payment was announced, enough people claimed it so that the pool for that $125 per person was, the pool for that money was capped at 30 million, under the theory that most people would choose the identity theft protection and the identity theft insurance. But enough people chose the $125 payment that it was reduced pro rata, and that was part of the agreement as well, reduced pro rata to something like $15 or something. It's I think about 10 times as many people claimed it as they estimated when they were negotiating the settlement. This also included a $175 million payment to the states. So those penalties I mentioned earlier, the $40,000 per occurrence penalty, that accrued to Iowa to the tune of about $1.3 million. There's a $100 million payment to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we use this money in settlements like this. The money that's paid in penalties to us, we have a consumer protection fund that is created by our statute, by our Consumer Fraud Act. And those penalties then are used to fund our activities. They're used to fund educational outreach. They're used to fund further investigations if we need to hire experts, or if we need to hire, or just to pay the attorneys and the investigators who work in the office. So it's a very valuable pot of money for us. And, and we use it to protect, that $1.3 million is going to help protect lots and lots of people from fraud in the future. So I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew to talk about some of the government imposter scams we've worked on together.
Thanks, Bill. So year after year, imposter scams and impersonation scams are one of the top categories that the division receives from consumers. I think it was number 4, I want to say, from last year, if I'm recalling correctly from the earlier slide that Bill was presenting. And so it tends to be one of the top issues about which our division is concerned. Imposter scams can cover a wide range of conduct, and some of the most typical ones are the ones I'm sure that you've heard of, like the grandparent scam. It's more of a person-to-person scam where someone overseas is calling an older Iowan and pretending to be the grandchild who's been locked up and needs an emergency bail payment from the grandparent, and then ask for gift card payments. And it's that sort of scam that would be classified as an imposter or an impersonation scam generally. And so we've all kind of heard of those, but many of us have not heard about or necessarily realized that there is a huge portion of those scams that impacts particularly small businesses. And that's with government imposter scams. And so we definitely wanted to cover that. And so a government imposter scam, I have the sort of my definition up here. I don't know if there's an official definition, and there's no official definition under Iowa law, because we apply our Iowa Consumer Product Standards to it about whether the conduct is deceptive, misleading, or unfair. But I define it as, language, iconography, or formatting that claims or heavily implies that the solicitor is associated with the government. And so I have 4 features here, and I'm actually going to go over a great example that Secretary Pate actually mentioned in his comments, and that Bill and I had the pleasure of working together on last year and the year before it. And so some of those features are, explicitly or impliedly threatening the recipient. And so that could include, there's like a fine if you don't respond, or there's, it says that there might be like something on the envelope that the solicitation comes in that says that, tampering with this is there's a fine, and that there may be a kernel of truth to that, but it implies the consumer will get in trouble if they don't respond. And so it's very coercive in that manner. It can involve, selling, alleged services that are not actually required of the consumer, or not really even beneficial to the consumer. And so really it's just a money grab. And then it could be, it's often that this alleged service is, for an inflated fee, even though, the consumer could attain the same result the solicitor is selling for free or much less expensive. Or it could also involve, a smaller sort of per victim loss to avoid scrutiny. And this is that a lot of these bigger operations that are operating in every state, including Iowa, they are, in my view, actively defrauding, thousands and thousands of consumers, but it may be for $50 each. And so most consumers just aren't going to hire an attorney to over $50. They may, request a refund. And then if that company is smart, the company will provide the refund and then just move on. And then basically take money from people who don't have the time or don't realize that they've been scammed or whatever to reap those benefits. And so it's actually a very pernicious scam. And again, it very much impacts small businesses. And on the whole, it extracts a lot of money from hardworking people who are just trying to comply with the rules and regulations, right? And so it's extracting money from our economy and giving it to scammers. And so I personally take great offense to it. So Bill, if we could go to the next slide. So this is actually part of the case that Secretary Pate mentioned in his beginning comments. And this is a case that Bill and I had the pleasure of working on together. And I will note that there's going to be a second slide after this. This is the first top half of the solicitation. And then the next slide I'll go over later will be the bottom half of the solicitation. And so I want to actually point out practically what was being used here in this case, because I think it helps us to see more practically how these scams work. Just as some background first, there is something called a certificate of existence in Iowa, and that's just a document that is provided by the Iowa Secretary of State, and it certifies that a corporate business or a corporate entity is in good standing with the state. And that just means that they filed their paperwork for their corporation, they're up to date on their reporting requirements. And so there is an LLC, for example, or there is a corporation on the books with Iowa. And this is used in a very limited circumstance. Like, for example, if a company is applying for a loan, perhaps the bank, as part of a due diligence process, wants to ensure that there is actually a corporation that is in existence that's applying, for this loan. And so they may ask for a certificate of existence to show that the business is in good standing. Otherwise, this document is totally unnecessary for a business to start, right? It's not the same thing as the incorporation papers that a business files with the Iowa Secretary of State to become an entity, to become a real business, right? And so, otherwise, unless you have a reason to need one, you don't need one, right? And so the cost in Iowa, it can vary by state, but in Iowa, it costs $5. So if you ever need one, you pay $5 to the Iowa Secretary of State, and then you can access your certificate of good standing. And the way that you do that in Iowa is that you go to the Iowa Secretary of State's website and you pay your $5 with your credit card, and then you click print, right? The document comes up and then you click print. It's that simple. So it's actually very, very cheap, very simple. And basically, not too many people need it, right? So that's the background. Now, there was a company that we became aware of, and it was called IA Certificate Service. Okay, and this company began sending solicitations that you see on the screen here to newly formed Iowa businesses, thousands upon thousands of Iowa businesses that were becoming active in Iowa. Now, I want to go over some of the features of this to explain, how this works. So, at the very top, you see the 2020 Certificate of Existence request form. In the upper left hand, you see a logo and a Des Moines address, right? You see it says IA Certificate Service and 2643 Beaver Avenue, Suite 124. Now, that implies that this is like a local company. If you're looking at this, you look and you say, oh, this is Iowa Certificate Service is located on Beaver Avenue in Des Moines. Well, if you Google, if you put this address into Google, you'll see it's a UPS store. So basically, there is no real business located here in Iowa, apart from, a UPS store where these responses can flow back through down to Florida, where the business really is. In the upper right hand, you see, records at certificatefilingservice.com. It sort of implies, not necessarily that it's a private company, but that it's a government entity. And then you see, as we go down, and sort of in the middle of it, it says in all caps, important, follow instructions exactly when completing this form, print clearly. So the first thing, if you're a consumer getting this form, you see is, oh, I need to follow these instructions. So you, you proceed to do that. And so, because it's in all caps, it's all bolded, and that is in stark contrast to the writing that is below it, which is much smaller, right? And I don't know if you all can actually read it very clearly, but, and we'll go over that in a second. Now, there's pre-filled in information in this form, right? So you see a key code, you see a notice date. Now, all of this information that's pre-filled in for the business is publicly accessible, right? And so, companies or individuals can scrape that information off the internet and put it into this form. But if you're a consumer receiving this, you may not know that, and you think, well, if they've got my information, it must be the government, right? Because the government has my information. And so that's another heavy implication that this is a government entity rather than a private company trying to take your money. Now, at the bottom, it says that at the very bottom, it says there's a business entity standing certificate fee, right? And it says that it costs $67.50. However, as I told you at the beginning, it only costs $5 if you get it directly from the Iowa Secretary of State. And this language, calling it a fee, makes it sound like it's a government fee rather than a alleged service that's being provided by this company. Now, the language is very small here, but part of it in the middle, it says that you have one step left in order to attain your certificate of existence. But as I said at the beginning, not everyone needs a certificate of existence, right? If you've just opened a business, that doesn't mean you're just about to get, a first loan or something like that. This heavily it confuses consumers because they don't know the difference between a certificate of existence and their incorporation documents that they filed. And so most of them are just going to fill this out, send the money, and not even think about it, right? Now, of course, in this font, in the very middle of it, it says Iowa Certificate Service is not affiliated with any government or state agency, and this notice is a solicitation of your business. It says that in the middle of that tiny font, surrounded by all this other stuff, right? And so most people aren't going to read it or see it. And if Bill, if you'd like to go to the next slide now. Now, this is the bottom of the solicitation, okay? And it says, do not skip this step in bold, right? And so you put in your name, email, and phone number there. And it says enclose, so payment, select payment method and double check payment information. Check your money order enclosed in the amount of $67.50 payable to this company. But however, I already told you it only costs $5 from the Iowa Secretary of State, right? And you know, the argument that a company like this makes is that, we're giving the consumer a convenient option to obtain this certificate, right? But look here, it takes 2 weeks. It says, please allow up to 2 weeks for processing and return of document. When you can go on the Iowa Secretary of State's website and print it immediately if you go through the government and pay your $5, right? So, and in this scenario, you have to wait 2 weeks and you have to send them a physical check, which takes more time to do. So is that more convenient for consumers? I would argue no. Now, the net impression, so whenever we look at these solicitations under our law, we're not looking necessarily at technical disclaimers, right? I mean, there was a disclaimer here, and I argue that these sorts of disclaimers, they tend to be, how can we shift blame back onto the victim of the scam, the consumer, rather than take responsibility for everything that we see on the solicitation, which is designed to mislead and to deceive consumers that this is a government document that they needed when they didn't need it, right? And so we look at what's called the net impression, meaning that we look at all of the features and combination and what is the actual impact on the consumer, right? And there may be a disclaimer here, but that doesn't necessarily mean every consumer saw it, read it, understood it, right? And so I will tell you all, we called Iowa consumers who had, mostly small businesses and charities in Iowa who had sent their $67.50 to this company to get a $5 document, right, that they didn't need. And not a single person with whom we spoke thought this was a private company. They all thought it was the government, number one. Number two, not a single person with whom we spoke even needed a certificate of existence for any reason whatsoever. So none of them were applying for a loan. None of them were doing anything where they actually needed this, right? And at some point in time, another point is like these certificates aren't even good anymore, right? So if you're applying for a loan and a bank needs to know if your business is in good standing, if you present them a 6-month-old certificate, that doesn't necessarily prove that your business is still in good standing at the time, right? So, just getting these at the very beginning of your business incorporation does not necessarily help you, right? So why is this a good scam? Well, the vast majority of businesses aren't going to sue over $67, right? And this company would, there's a couple people who complained and got their money back, right? But most people aren't going to notice that this even happened, right? And so when we were calling people, they didn't even notice that this had happened, that they had been the victim of a scam. But in the aggregate, as I've said, $67.50 here and there adds up. And in this case, as Secretary Pate mentioned, we had over 1,200 people, right? 1,200 small businesses, sometimes multiple businesses owned by the same person, sending money to this guy down in Florida, right? And again, there's a disclaimer here, but and it's technically there, but it's really an argument to shift the blame onto the consumer, which is the victim of the scam, and that's not fair. And also, it's a good scam because it targets newly incorporated businesses, right? And so, new business owners that are going through the process of incorporation, there's a lot of paperwork involved in that. They may be, using another service to file their paperwork. They may have an attorney. They may be, signing a lot of documents. They're kind of on autopilot, and they may be just new to business, and so they're not aware of how all of these things work. And so, this particular scam takes advantages of new business owners, and those are the business owners that are trying to follow the rules. They're trying to be compliant. They're trying to do the right thing. They think they're supposed to do this when they're not, right? And so it's particularly nefarious. Now, I will end on this by saying, I'm very proud of this case that Bill and I worked on. We ended up suing this company and the owner in his personal capacity. And after litigating for approximately a year, we were able to obtain a consent judgment. And that consent judgment provided that all 1,200 small Iowa businesses and charities got their money back automatically. So it was like $79,000 that went back to all Iowans who were defrauded. we allege. And we totally banned the company from coming back to Iowa. So we've prevented this company from continuing to siphon money away from businesses. So yeah, we're very proud of this case. Bill, you can go to the next slide. So that's one case that targets small businesses. Another one that we see, we just wanted to mention is, as I've said, the best lies have a kernel of truth, right? And so it is true, for example, that some businesses of certain size have to have certain posters in their break rooms or whatnot involving labor law. And there's companies out there that will solicit your business to buy posters. However, these posters, to the extent your business has to have a poster, they are totally free. They're on the Department of Labor website. So you do not have to pay for them. If you want to pay a company for them, you can do that, but you don't have to. And to the extent a company is implying, like in the last example, that this is it's required to pay for them through the company, that could be consumer fraud. Now I do want to, so those are two scams that impact all business, right? That is incorporated with the state. I do want to mention scams that target specific industries. And this is an example here. This is another case that I was proud to do for the office. And in this case, a trucker, so if you're a trucker, remember there's a kernel of truth to every good lie. So a trucker has to file with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, has to file a biannual update, okay, if they're licensed. So that is true. They do have to do that. And it's true, if you don't file it, you could incur a civil penalty, right? It's totally free to file the report. It's very simple to file the report, right? And so there's a company that would send mailers. Now on the upper left-hand side, that's the outside of the mailer that Iowa truckers would get. It has an eagle looking thing on the upper left-hand side that looks like a government logo, right? It's got an all red important past due non-compliance notice on the very outside. So when you get this, you're freaking out because you're thinking, oh no, I've made a mistake. What's the mistake? And so you open, right, this packet, and you see there's a non-compliance notice here. And you're impliedly threatened with this civil penalty if you don't submit your biennial update. And then this company will charge you a fee for something that's totally free and simple to do, right? And so that's the scam. And so in this case, we were able to reach a settlement that banned this company from doing this, again, to protect Iowa truckers from giving up their hard-earned money when they didn't need to, and getting consumer refunds for those who paid for this service that, in our view, is useless, if not marginally useful, and not outweighed by the possibility that consumers are going to be misled by this. I'll turn it back to Bill.
Hi, yeah, and I'm noticing that we're running a little short on time here. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly through these. Some other scams we worked on in our office, and I've worked on personally. We sued and got permanent injunctions and large judgments that we'll never be able to enforce against some scammers in the Davenport area who were cold calling businesses and offering advertisements. They claimed to be affiliated with the local chamber of commerce or local high school, and they were selling advertisements on things like, they claimed on things like, the Ankeny high school football schedule, and would have advertisements across the bottom. So they would call people like realtors and insurance agents and things like that who would want to advertise locally to local consumers. And they would send, they would charge these people hundreds of thousands of dollars and say, we're going to distribute thousands of these in your community. And at most, they would print up 25 or 50 of these, send them to the insurance agent, send them to the realtor. And it would be this cheap looking poster with the Ankeny football schedule on it. And then it would have their mocked up ad on the bottom, and then a bunch of fake ads for national companies like McDonald's or Pizza Hut or things like that, who would also, it was believable in the sense that those companies would also probably advertise locally. But I guess for that scam, I would just say, be wary of people who are calling to solicit your business, cold calling you for things like advertising or consulting. Both of these businesses, if you look them up on the Better Business Bureau, had an F. they also employed in the course of their scam, fake invoice scams. They would just send invoices to people they had previously dealt with, saying you owe us this money for the advertising, threatening to report to collections, things like that. This goes back to the government imposter scam idea as well. They're preying on people's desire to do the right thing. Like most small business owners want to pay their bills, and if they think they owe money, and they get this bill saying they owe money, they are likely to pay it if they think it's true. And so there are also lots of data security and identity theft scams that can happen. Phishing scams, which they'll email you one of your employees, perhaps they'll open a malicious link and get access to your systems that way. Ransomware scams, if you have a website or servers that are external facing, those might get hacked, and then they'll want to ransom to unhack your systems. Email scams, sometimes they'll hijack your company email to send out fake requests to customers, route the money to themselves. Another form of imposter scam, in addition to the government imposter scam, is sort of impersonating the CEO or owner or another high-level employee at a company. And often what that entails is emailing one of your employees and saying, I urgently need you to send $10,000 to Nigeria for this deal. So a lot of these are just educate your employees and make sure you have good controls over where your money's going. And so the last thing we wanted to do is to provide some tips for avoiding these scams, which I think we've kind of tried to sprinkle throughout this, but we've got a few slides on that as well. So Andrew.
So make sure people who are paying your invoices are familiar with a lot of these scams that we've talked about, and you may want to limit your authority on people who can pay certain invoices to those who are educated about these scams. Next slide. And then scrutinize every invoice. There's a lot of scams that are, just like the one we discussed, where it looks like an invoice, but it really isn't. No service has actually been provided or will be provided. And they're looking for you to pay that, and then they can obtain information about your routing number and stuff. And you definitely want to keep that secure. So be very careful about invoices that you get. They're not necessarily legitimate invoices. Next slide. Just because you're a newly formed business, getting a lot of paperwork and whatnot. If you get pre-filled information in a form, that doesn't mean it's the government who's sending it to you. That information is publicly accessible and can be used, and it can be used to try to target you for a scam. Next slide. Oh, I already said that one. I guess if it's pre-filled, be very careful about it. And then many of the forms that you need are going to be on the Iowa Secretary of State's website for free or very minimal cost. So don't pay money for things you don't need. Bill?
And just another piece of advice I would add is when possible, pay by credit card, because credit cards have a lot of protections for consumers, for fraud, dispute mechanisms, things like that, to protect people who use the credit card. If you pay by a wire transfer, check, something like that, once the money's out of your account, it's gone. We've had lots of cases in which we aren't able to get the money back. But if the consumer was able to file a credit dispute, the credit card company will do charge back, which if you run a small business, you're familiar with. And then the fraudsters won't get the money. And another thing is just make sure you have good digital security, good password hygiene, change your passwords often, make them long. And sometimes, you can make a password long just by adding 10 periods to the end of it. And that increases the difficulty of hacking it by an order of magnitude. And if you have a Wi-Fi in your business, just make sure to change the default login settings, because sometimes the default login setting is like admin and the password is password, and that's terrible and easily hacked. So with that, I would say thank you. And we'd really appreciate hearing from you about any frauds or scams you're seeing, any attempted scams that you think might be worth us looking into, or any other sort of questions and comments you have in the couple minutes we have left here.
Yep, so we have a few minutes left for questions. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A chat box, or if you would like to respond to Bill and Andrew's questions about what you're seeing, you can do that as well. And then since we are running a little bit low on time, I can also go ahead and forward any questions that people have on. So if you do want to post those to be answered later, feel free to do that as well. And thank you again to Bill and Andrew.
Yes, thank you.
Not seeing anything right now, but I'll wait like another minute or two and see. All right, it looks like we currently don't have any questions. So if I receive anything, I'll go ahead and forward that on. And thank you again for your time today, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Yeah.
So great
Thank you.
information. Yep,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Bye.